Welcome, everyone. And here we are again at the profound treasury of the ocean of Dharma. We're going to be discussing chapters 16 and 17 today of volume 2, having to do with the Bodhisattva path and the Bodhisattva vow. And we have been working our way through these volumes. A couple of announcements. Next week, I'm going to be sending out, rather this week, I'll be sending out in the email a reading on the refuge vow, as well as instructions if you want to buy the whole book from which it comes. There is a little book called The Refuge Vow, a source book. And there's also one called The Bodhisattva Vow, a source book that you can purchase on Amazon. But I will send out the key, or what I think are the key chapters, the ones by Trungpa Rinpoche, in PDF form for you to read. And next week we will be discussing the chapter on the refuge vow, and the week after the chapter on the Bodhisattva vow, and the week after that we will have the vows all on Tuesdays. So we will not be doing the profound treasury for the next 3 weeks following this week. Instead, we will be doing these 2 chapters, first on the refuge vow, then the Bodhisattva vow, and then the actual ceremony itself. Now, if you are interested in taking the vows and you haven't spoken with me, please make an appointment. We can have a one-on-one conversation about it, and that's necessary. FYI, if you have never taken either of these vows, then you are a candidate for the refuge vow. That comes first. And you have to take that vow and then wait a month or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever it is. There has to be a gap before you can take the Bodhisattva vow. There are reasons to take these vows. One is that you are inspired by the meaning of the vow. And for that, I would recommend doing these readings and coming to these classes if you haven't clarified that already in your own mind. And the other is that these vows are prerequisites for proceeding further on the path into the Vajrayana practices. You have to have taken refuge in Bodhisattva vows before you can do that. So, all that said, tonight we're going to welcome Dan Epstein. He's going to be discussing chapter 16, and then I'll be doing chapter 17. So, Dan.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for letting me do this. So this chapter, becoming a Bodhisattva, right? Trungpa Rinpoche starts it out with a kind of a warning, I think, which he revisits in a later paragraph. The bodhicitta that has been transplanted into your heart is at jeopardy, as you need to transcend goal orientation. Okay. So bodhicitta is in jeopardy because we have to watch out for our tendency to be goal oriented. Okay. And he's telling us that doesn't mean, he goes on to say, it doesn't mean that you have complete tranquility, that you never lose your temper. It doesn't mean that you've, become a Buddha or you don't have any doubts, but he says there is a sense of openness and warmth and compassion, and there are no grudges against anything, no grinding our teeth. So we can, without becoming, perfect little Buddhas, we can at least, not, just give up the daily fight that we're used to, grinding your teeth. And once you've made this decision, you have your direction. He says there's no need for reinforcement. And then he says one of his typical kind of things. Seeking reinforcement is the action of a coward. Okay. Remind me not to ask you questions, John. The function of the teacher is to encourage you to do it yourself. So the teacher's business goes on. So the reinforcement we need is just the encouragement that we're doing this on our own. He says that way, this whole thing becomes really workable, up to date. And he says at that point, you may be surprised that your shamatha vipassana becomes much more spacious. You still have your doubts, but you use it. You work your doubt into compassion. You may have the opposite of doubt. You may be elated. So he says you may have your joy, and that's a danger too. So you work your joy into wisdom and inspiration. And he says something that I've I think I know what he means. He says, sudden glimpses, sudden flashes of awareness come much more often. That's where I see progress in my practice on a personal level. People talk about the gaps in between thoughts. Sometimes I just get the feeling that those gaps are a few microseconds longer, So you get glimpses, sudden flashes, It's not a constant, constant state of mind. And as a matter of fact, looking for that constancy is, puts us in jeopardy too. You get high and joyful and confident, but in the back of your mind, there's a fear that this may wear out. And that's the problem with, I've heard people say that, being, feeling dejected or down when you get criticism or feeling good because you get praise is just as bad as feeling dejected when you get criticism. Because if you feel good about the praise, then you just want more of it and you're afraid of losing. And I think that's what he's talking about here. So you have this fear of losing this good feeling. And he says, but that fear is necessary and good too. In fact, that the fear is a source of discipline. And I think what he means by that is that the fear disciplines you to kind of beware of that good feeling you get when something from the outside, you're perceiving something from the outside as making you feel good. So if you start to have the fear that you're going to lose the good feeling, that's a good clue that it's not really coming from the right place. So that's the discipline. And this is my interpretation of it anyway. And so he says, by joining the choiceless quality of meditation, which he'll talk a little bit later, but I think in this context right now, the choiceless quality of meditation is kind of the equal equanimity, the hovering, that we try to do when we practice, just to observe things, not get caught up in them. So it's choiceless. And the heroism of practicing the paramitas, that's where you bring the Hinayana and the Mahayana together. In the Hinayana, we learned the choiceless quality of meditation. And in the Mahayana, we learned about the paramitas, generosity, compassion, those things. And when we join them together, this is very important. We can't do one without the other. And he says, to illustrate this, he says, if you stop sitting, you're wasting your time. If you just try to practice the paramitas, but you give up your sitting practice, you're wasting your time. And not that it's dangerous to do so, but it's a waste of energy. And he says it might be better to stand on a street corner and sell ties. Another, colorful metaphor. Okay. And the next section is called egolessness and loneliness. And this took me a lot of reading and rereading. And I'm not, Xing out discussing this chapter role. It took a lot of rereading because I had to give up what my conception of loneliness is, because I think he's talking about something very different. Okay, so he goes on to say that after taking the Bodhisattva vow, there's a possibility of slipping and regressing, right? And this is where he goes back to the introductory lines. The bodhicitta that has been transplanted in your heart is at jeopardy, and you need to transcend goal orientation, right? He goes, when we learned in the Hinayana about meditation, it still has a quality of ambition and goal orientation. You're trying to achieve something with your meditation, whether it's tranquility or bliss or relaxation, whatever you want to call it. And it says, that although the Hinayana discusses what he calls the non-existence of self, it says the Hinayana only partly understands the wholeness of that statement. It's not only the non-existence of self, but it's the non-existence of dharmas. And I think in this case, dharma is being used as the existence of any separate phenomena. The understanding of the non-existence provides them with a feeling of glory or promise, because we only see in the Hinayana, he says that it's really focusing on looking at egolessness as a goal, right? So he says, so a kind of achievement orientation continues, and that can be a problem. He says, getting rid of the goallessness is important to understand egolessness. And egoless is not only your own non-existence, but also the non-existence of a reference point. And it's not that we don't exist, but I think, we don't exist in the way that we thought we did. Our egos give us a sense of something separate and independent self. And he's saying that's what we need to get rid of, right? And that's what he's calling loneliness. It's not the loneliness, it's not the neurotic loneliness that we're used to thinking about loneliness as, or at least I was. It's the loneliness of what he was saying before, is that this is a journey that we have to do ourselves. People can encourage us, a spiritual friend, whoever, our Dharma brothers and sisters, but it's still our journey. And he says the loneliness becomes an exciting adventure. And then he also says, now that could be a problem or a promise too. We expand and share the greater vision of the Mahayana. And he says that actually creates a crescendo, an immense drama, a sudden excitement. And up to this point in the Hinayana, we've really been engaged in much smaller scale of thinking. And now we're exposed to the excitement of the Mahayana. And this can be a problem too, because we've expanded our view of the world and it seems very exciting and all that. And so he says, nevertheless, there is still your own loneliness. And again, he doesn't mean, but we're still left with some lonely feeling. He's talking about something much bigger than that loneliness. He says in the Mahayana, the egoless aspect of loneliness continues. in the realization of the non-existence of the self. He's saying the self is something we make up. It doesn't exist, right? It's our awareness, either because of the skandhas or whatever. We have this illusion of some independent self. It doesn't exist. Okay? And he says the problem this can lead to is once you think about that, once you realize that, if this seems exciting to you, he says the possible excitement of watching yourself attaining enlightenment, you have to give that up too, because then that becomes another goal. So the further we go into this, the more complicated it gets. He says, you have to go away to disappear. You know, we're not used to thinking about this, right? Like this. He says the ego part has to disappear. This goes against all our training about becoming somebody. Ram Dass used to talk about that, being nobody. He said we're born and then we're automatically engaged in somebody training. We're training to become somebody. The name of his book is Being Nobody. Ram Dass. He says the ego part has to disappear. The reference point does not exist. You have to give up reference points, because all reference points are about ego. All reference points are about the self and the other. They create separations. The reference point could be, I am this type of person. I'm the type of person who, I drive a Ferrari. I wear a Rolex watch. You know, that's a reference point. A reference can be, you know, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative. These are all reference points. These are all narratives we have about ourselves. Okay, he says the reference point does not exist. He says loneliness, again, giving up the ego, becomes heroism because you are fighting this particular war all by yourself. The war against ego, the war against samsara, the war against suffering, the war against the non-truth. So he says you're not relying on anybody's help to work with sentient beings or to work with, you're not relying on anybody's help to work with sentient beings or to work with yourself. The spiritual friend is just an advisor who tells you how lonely you are and how such an individual fight is necessary. Bill Wilson wrote in the world of the recovery space in his big book. It's written by anonymous, but Bill Wilson wrote it. He says, there's a line in there, it says, you have to give up old ideas absolutely, or the results will be nil. And studying Buddhism really, it reminds me of that. You have to give up all old ideas absolutely, or the results will be nil. Right? If you give up half your old ideas, you don't get half results. If you whatever you cling on to, you have to give up all old ideas absolutely. So you do not get any personal help. Nobody's going to be a co-pilot. And he says, so at the Mahayana level, loneliness begins to dissolve to a certain extent. And he's talking about the ego. The restriction of loneliness dissolves and the essence of loneliness becomes egolessness. That's what I meant before. We're giving up our old ideas about what loneliness meant. Trungpa Rinpoche equates it with heroism. Then he talks about the 5 powers that we gain. And he says these powers are not, powers in the way we're used to thinking about them, but they are confirmations and law and landmarks. The first power is having a spiritual friend. That's the companion who initiates you into the Bodhisattva vow. Second power is awakening from your particular family into the Mahayana family. And that's, to me, again, that reminded me of leaving old ideas, giving up old ideas, absolutely. And coming into a new family, giving up the familiar. Family is familiar, right? And being inspired to work with others rather than on yourself alone. The third power is that the virtue begins to expand. And this is where no reference to your own achievement as being important. So we're doing this because we're motivated to do good things, but we have to look at this as not a reference to our own achievement, as being a do-gooder or whatever. You begin to extend the possibilities of attaining enlightenment. So the more we can give this up, another label, that we're now a bodhisattva, the better our chances are. The fifth power is that we are able to identify what we have learned with our own practice. And he says that you're able to, you start relating, this to your own experience and start incorporating it in your own situation. It's a way of binding, next section, binding yourself to the teacher, to the teachings. Okay, it says now, he says, now you would like to tighten up the whole thing, make sure that you're doing it right. And he says, I guess the Tibetan term is dompa, or binding. And he says this applies to all the vows. So the refuge vow. And the binding is the discipline in yourself to keep that aspiration going. He says to live up to your aspiration in the sense of the Bodhisattva vow. Right? But it's an aspiration. It doesn't mean that you're going to do everything like some idea you have of a perfect Bodhisattva. He says, and you have to give up the idea of attaining enlightenment for yourself. You're attaining enlightenment for the benefit of others, not yourself. This is a big one, right? So we come to this studying Buddhism with the idea of achieving something that's going to get rid of our suffering. And we find out the way to do that is to want that for everyone else, not ourselves. I was on a retreat with Bob Thurman once, and he did this a few times in a row, a couple of years in a row. He had what was called the Shantideva challenge. The Shantideva, wrote The Way of the Bodhisattva, and it's the line he wrote that it's often attributed to the Dalai Lama. He says, all happiness comes from wanting happiness for others, right? No happiness comes from wanting happiness for yourself. Your happiness comes from wanting happiness to others. So the Shantideva challenge was, he challenged anybody to show how they felt happier by only wanting happiness for themselves. That was the challenge. I don't think anybody ever won it. Having done such a thing, there's an immense input into your memory. And this is, I think, a really important line. He says, you realize what you have done, you realize what you are stuck with, that particular process and style of thinking for the rest of this life, as well as lives to come. So once you realize this, there's no going back. Once you realize that wanting these things for other people is the only true way to really be happy, and not focusing on yourself. Once you realize it, even though you may act differently, and I know this for myself, even though I act differently than that aspiration all the time, I'm aware of it, and there's no going back to not being aware of it. There just isn't. It's not that I have to beat myself up for it, but I can't pretend that I don't know what's good for me. Says you can't shake it off by saying it was a rehearsal. It becomes part of your basic existence. And then he just ends up by saying, simply taking the Bodhisattva vow does not make you a Bodhisattva. You have taken the Bodhisattva vow and you have gone through a training process, which is really our sitting practice and our studying, and, you know, whatever, however else we, you know, practice, but I think it's mainly our sitting practice and our understanding of the philosophy. And it says, and then you finally begin to tread on the Mahayana path and become a Bodhisattva. And I will close there.
Thank you, Dan. The next chapter, joining profundity and vastness. And really, we're going deeper into a lot of the same ideas, or approaching them from different angles, maybe. The point about giving up goal orientation is that goal orientation only lives in thought. And thought has to do with the past and the future, and it's fundamentally a fiction. And it's a fiction about me and what I'm lacking. So it has to do with my sorrow, my feeling of poverty. And when we have a goal, there's this feeling, I'm lacking something, so I need to get to this goal. So there's just fundamental unhappiness in it all the way. We all have different kinds of goals, but and some of them are necessary. You know, you have the goal of going to the grocery store or whatever, but these are very practical considerations. I'm talking about, for instance, a fundamental goal like I'm going to become saner, happier, enlightened, whatever it may be. And it implies that I'm not sane enough, I'm not happy enough, and that feeling of poverty is in itself painful. It's the very essence of what in Buddhism we call samsara, suffering, dukkha. And when we give up goal orientation, we're doing what Trungpa Rinpoche called switching your loyalty. Switching your loyalty from the world of thoughts, of schemes, of constant worry, of constant self-aggrandizement, of feelings of poverty that you have to, so you have to enrich yourself. You're switching your loyalty from all of that, which goes on in our minds, to what? To appreciating this world as it arises right now. This world of the present moment, which requires no thinking. It's just right here, aware. You understand what's going on. You can see everything going on around you, and you know what's happening. And when we begin to do that, as we do, and that's really the essence of meditation. Meditation is not just about calming the mind. It's about switching your allegiance to this world, which we can do in flashes or moments or minutes or hours or whatever it may be, each one of us differently. We're switching our allegiance from the unhappy fictions that live in our thoughts, these unhappy stories, to appreciation of this world as it actually arises now in the present moment, in all its beauty and openness and constant change. This is really what meditation is about. When he talks about beginning to practice the paramitas, paramita is a word, it means a Sanskrit word. It means transcendent virtue. And when it's transcending is ego. It's going beyond ego. That means that it lives in this present moment. And the first of these is generosity. That simply by coming present and giving up one's sense of self, in other words, coming into what he calls loneliness here. Loneliness is giving up the sense of self. It's not that you're going around feeling miserable, lonely. Oh God, I want some company. If you're doing that, then you're not truly lonely. This is the loneliness of the paramitas. And when you do that, you can be really openly generous, naturally so, which is the first paramita, because you've given up self-aggrandizement. You've given up that dream of me, 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 at least for an instant or more. And during that instant or more, you can behave towards the people in your world much more generously, because you're not trying to manipulate them and your world into some hoped for, imagined Valhalla present, some little heaven. So in beginning to appreciate this beautiful world that we inhabit, this vivid world that we inhabit, we begin to open. And in that opening, we become much more generous because we've given up that self-aggrandizement, that self-orientation all the time, which is such a sorrow. That feeling of self, me, what am I getting? And I'm worried about me. It's such a pain for us, for each one of us. And so entering the Mahayana, the first stage of the Mahayana, we're going to be coming to this in later chapters, is called pramudita. It means great joy. And the joy is in discovering this open dimension in which one can afford to be open and interactive and contributing to everything and everyone that arises in the present moment. This is not a matter of theory. This is not a matter of becoming some kind of ideal person in your own mind, like you've got this ideal. I once was having a conversation with a person that I regard as being a true Bodhisattva. He's since passed. He was a Zen priest. And his name was Kobanchino Sensei, and then he became a Roshi. And he had a rather tragic death. And he was a wonderful person. And I was saying to him, maybe I ought to do more. Maybe look at someone like Mother Teresa. She just gives and gives. It's outrageous. And here I am, I'm just sort of living this life in the lap of luxury. And he said this: a bodhisattva finishes the conversation with the person sitting across the table. And he was sitting across the table from me, looking at me. It's that openness, that constant responsiveness, being here for the life that we have as it unfolds according to our karma. It was my karma that I was sitting there with him that day. And that brings us to the paramitas, and there are 6 of them that we're going to be talking about later. Actually, there are 10, but the 6 are the most famous. And we'll go about that in some place. So really, we are shifting our allegiance from samsara to enlightened mind, to the mind of enlightenment. The mind of samsara is all about thought. That's where confusion lives. That's where unhappiness and suffering live, in the world of thought. And in that thought, there's always goal orientation, because the thoughts are always about making something better. And making something better has as its implication that something is lacking. Otherwise, why would you want to make it better? And there's a sorrow in that, a pain in that little story. It's an unhappy story. So we start with chapter 17, and he says, when you take the Bodhisattva vow, you are not intensely mimicking the Buddha or the Bodhisattvas. You do not feel particularly belittled by trying to follow your example. You are simply take on the twofold attitude of a Bodhisattva, profundity and vastness. Now, these are code words, profundity and vastness. And the vastness comes from a Buddhist saint, as it were, saint. He lived in the 600s, so that's the 7th century. His name was Asanga. And the profundity comes from Nagarjuna, who lived in the 2nd century AD, this is. So they came much after the Buddha. Buddha lived, typical dates are about 560 to 480 BC. So they're living hundreds of years after him. Nagarjuna, sometimes called the second Buddha, he took the Buddha's teachings on the Prajnaparamita. The one you might be familiar with is the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra is sort of a quintessential, there are different versions of the Prajnaparamita teachings. Prajnaparamita means the transcendent virtue of wisdom, prajna. Paramita is transcendent. It's actually the 6th of the 6 paramitas. And there's Prajnaparamita literature. And you have the Prajnaparamita literature in as many as 100,000 shlokas that they're called, that's the word for verses, all the way down to the Prajnaparamita in one letter, the Sanskrit letter A. There's the 25,000 verse Prajnaparamita, the 8,000 verse. The one that you might be familiar with is the Heart Sutra, which is the Prajnaparamita in one page, more or less. It starts out, how does it start out? Once the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajagriha at Vulture Peak Mountain, together with a great gathering of the Sangha of monks, and so forth. And you remember there are these famous lines, no eye, no ear, there is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, and there's no wisdom, no attainment, and no non-attainment. This is the Prajnaparamita literature. Nagarjuna, who lived in the 2nd century, took that literature and he explained it philosophically. And he created a school of philosophy, a Buddhist philosophy, which became immensely important in the development of Buddhism. It's called Madhyamaka, and which means the middle way school. And we will study some of the Madhyamaka thought. And it underlies the Madhyamaka thought and the Prajnaparamita teachings, which it's explaining, underlie Tantra when we get all the way to the Vajrayana. It really carries through. So Nagarjuna was this great person, and supposedly there are sort of 2 different versions of his life. One is ordinary. He lived, 80 years or something like that, 60, 80 years. And he was this philosopher. Another is that he lived 800 years. How about that? And you may be familiar, some of you, with what's called the Terma tradition. The Terma means hidden teachings. Hidden teachings, a teacher has some teachings which she feels are inappropriate for the people of their time, his or her time. And so this teacher hides those teachings, knowing that they will be discovered in the future, and even by whom. Now, most of these terma, these hidden treasures, were hidden by Padmasambhava, who went to Tibet in the 8th century. And there are many, many, many in the Tibetan tradition. But the Prajnaparamita literature actually is a terma hidden by the Buddha, supposedly. This is the mythic version of the story. And he gave these teachings. He knew that they were inappropriate. When he gave the Heart Sutra on Vulture Peak Mountain in Rajagriha, you can go there. It's right just north of Bodh Gaya, the place where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. And he took his monks to this mountaintop. It's really just a bump in the hill, but there's a peak up there. And today you can go up and sit there. There's a terrace with a wall around it. And he gave them supposedly the Heart Sutra teachings, and a bunch of them, the arhats, the Hinayanas, had heart attacks. They weren't ready for it. That's the myth. So what the Buddha did, according to this version of his life, Nagarjuna did, is he took these teachings and he went down into the ocean. Now there are 3 levels of world, you might say. There's the gods up there in the sky. There's the human realm that we live in with animals here on earth. And down below us in the watery realms, that's where the serpent deities called the Nagas live. And so he took it all the way down into the oceans. There are Nagas who live in streams, lakes, ponds. But the main Naga kingdom is in the ocean. And so Nagarjuna took the Prajnaparamita literature and, not Nagarjuna, I mean, the Buddha sent the literature down there and he gave it to the Nagas to keep until the world was ready. So Nagarjuna knew about this, and his name actually means Nagarjuna, conqueror of the Nagas. He went down. He didn't have an aqualung, but he went down into the ocean to their kingdom, and he made them all sick. And they didn't know that it was he who made them sick. But then he went to them and he said, look, I can cure you of your sickness, but I have a price. I want the Prajnaparamita literature. And they said, oh, yes. And he cured them. They gave him the literature. He brought it back to earth. And that's the story of the mythical version of the story of how we got the Prajnaparamita literature. Or maybe not mythical. Who knows? Up to you. And this literature, this school is very, very philosophical, intellectual. It's very powerful, but it's very dry, like the Heart Sutra. And it's full of conundrum. Now, Asanga lived several hundred years later, and he founded a school that was called variously, the Yogacara school. Sometimes it's called the Chittamatra school. Chittamatra means mind only. And this school developed some very, very important doctrines, which we're not going to go into here, but we'll study them because they are terribly important, again, in the development of the Mahayana and also into the Vajrayana. And Asanga was a great saint. And the story goes that he was having difficulty with his progress on the path. And one day he was walking down a path and he saw this dog lying in the middle of the path. And the dog was dying. Its flesh was rotting. It was half alive, half dead. And maggots were eating the flesh. And Asanga was so moved, like with compassion, that he bent down. He wanted to remove the maggots from the dog's flesh to relieve the dog of the suffering of being eaten alive. But then he realized he didn't want to kill the maggots. So he removed them with his tongue. What an amazing story. And then he had been trying to have a vision of the Buddha Maitreya, the Buddha of the future. And when he did that, remove these maggots with his tongue, suddenly Maitreya appeared to him and gave him teaching. This is a story of compassion, and what it means is that Asanga represents extreme compassion. And so these 2 aspects of the Bodhisattva path, profundity and vastness. The vastness is a code word for compassion. And the profundity refers to really the teachings of Nagarjuna, which have, above all, to do with emptiness, with shunyata. All of what he taught is an explanation in one way or another of how nothing has any true existence, neither I nor others, this table, that computer, all are just appearances that come up in the present moment. And as I turn my head, the computer's gone. As I turn back, here it comes again. These words, gestures, as I touch my thighs, I feel the physical sensation. There are the words coming out of this mouth. And so really what Nagarjuna's teaching is all about is this exploration of emptiness and the two fundamental statements about emptiness, that neither I, this I, nor other, this pen, have any true existence. And true existence is a technical term in this philosophy. it's called svabhava in Tibetan, rangjin, svabhava in Sanskrit, which means own being. And rangjin means the same thing in Tibetan. And what it means is this, that we think that things have their own being. And in having their own being, they have three fundamental properties that we ascribe to them, none of which are actually true. The first is we think that things exist ongoing, unchanging through time. There is nothing, according to Buddhism, and according to our experience actually, that exists ongoing, unchanging through even an instant. Because everything, like this gesture, as it's born, it's dying. As these words come out, as they appear, they're dying. As these visual sensations, I'm looking out the window, now I'm looking at the computer, it's all constantly changing. The idea that something exists in time is just that, an idea. That's the first quality of own being that Nagarjuna denied. The second quality is that things are unitary. But they're not unitary. Everything's made up of parts, and the parts are made up of parts. And they used to think that the smallest part was the protons and the neutrons of an atom, and now they find out that there are even smaller particles than that. And actually, do they have any true existence? They're constantly in flux, becoming energy. This is modern physics. But Nagarjuna and the early Buddhists said this long before. And the last thing is that things exist independently, that there's this I that has an independent existence, doesn't matter what happens with you or anything else. And what they're saying is, no, nothing exists interdependently. Everything exists in dependence on everything else. So I'm here in conversation with you, and you with me, and we're all utterly interconnected, part of a whole that has no limit, is utterly infinite. This goes on and on and on. I love the Galaxy song. If you don't know it, go to YouTube and Google and ask for Eric Idle from Monty Python, the Galaxy song. And in the end, the last verse goes, the universe itself keeps on expanding and expanding in all of the directions it can whiz. As fast as it can go, the speed of light, 12 million miles a minute, and that's the fastest speed there is. That's the beginning of the last verse. So remember when you're feeling very small and insecure, how extremely unlikely is your birth. And pray that there's intelligent life somewhere out in space, because it's bugger all down here on Earth. But listen to the whole song. It's terrific from beginning to end. And in fact, there are two versions you should listen to. One with Eric Idle when he's young, and he comes out of a refrigerator. John Cleese opens a refrigerator door, and Eric Idle steps out and starts singing to this little old lady, who's actually another guy dressed up as a little old lady, starts singing her the song, and the wall falls away, and they step out into the universe. But the other version of the song, it's the same song, slightly changed, sung with Eric Idle and Stephen Hawking. And they're going along, and Stephen Hawking's in his wheelchair, and they're singing the song together. So this is the vastness. This is the profundity, the lack of self, the lack of any true existence for anything. Everything is a constant presentation and a constant changing presentation. And he says some things here. Let's just take a look. He's talking about prajna. Prajna is a two-edged sword. Now, he says it cuts I and am. I have a difficulty with that. Normally, when people talk about it, it's cutting I, belief in I, and belief in other. That's where the two-edged sword is. And this is wielded, this sword, by the way, by the Bodhisattva of wisdom, of Prajna, whose name is Manjushri. And he holds this two-edged sword in his right hand. And it cuts simultaneously these two false beliefs, beliefs in I and belief in other, and frees us into this beautifully ever-changing, instantaneously present world. So he says, he's talking about the sword of Manjushri. He says, I am, consists of tremendous hunger and thirst, immense wretchedness, and a terribly deprived feeling. Every time we reassert our own being relative to other beings, there's this feeling of thirst, hunger, wretchedness, unhappiness. And this is really the problem of the Buddhist path, is in dealing with this sorrow. This is what brings us to the Buddhist path. That feeling of hunger, thirst, immense wretchedness, and a terribly deprived feeling. A fundamental poverty, he calls it. When you say I am, you feel hungry, thirsty, deprived, and lonely. That very term, that very concept is filled with fundamental poverty. And he says, the only thing that'll cheer you up is the verb that follows the proclamation, I am. I am drinking, I am happying, I am this and thating. That kind of cheers you up a little bit for a moment. Now the vastness, that's a key word or a code word for compassion, and it really refers to a sangha, who, with the the dog and the maggots. And above all, it's having a compassionate approach to yourself, that you can afford to be just this simple human being here in relationship to other human beings. And when you begin to have that kind of kindness for yourself, you can begin to spread it to others and have a kindness for others and fall in love. And he says, when you develop that kind of sympathetic attitude, all that ego pain actually begins to dissolve. And I was talking to a friend of mine who is in a helping profession, a nurse. And this person was talking about what great happiness they've gotten from being of service to others. And I think we can all participate in that. That the kindness to oneself becomes kindness to others, and the world begins to open up into a warmth, a warm world. When you develop that kind of sympathetic attitude, he writes, says, all that ego pain actually begins to dissolve. So there's great compassion that begins to develop on the Mahayana path. It's karuna is the Sanskrit word, so great compassion is maha karuna. And there are different aspects of it. There's the great compassion itself, which provides a quality of freedom. Freedom from what? Freedom from these constant jockeying, constant manipulation, constant trying to plan for one's happiness or unhappiness, to deal with it. That you can be free of that, of the evaluation, constant evaluation which underlies that. And the only way to do that is by coming present and switching your loyalty. And also, but there are aids. There are aids to it. You can figure it out using the Nagarjuna approach of thinking through it, and we'll be doing a bit of that. And you can do it by being kind to others, working in a soup kitchen, who knows what. He says that freedom is absent aggression and struggle, no possibility of resentment toward yourself or others or the situation. And it is a source of great genuineness in the practitioner. Why is it a great genuineness? It's because you're giving up the schemes of thought. You can, when you meet somebody, and you can see sometimes in people's eyes that they're thinking, saying one thing and thinking another. What do we call that? Hidden intention. There's a term.
Hidden agenda.
Hidden agenda, thank you. Hidden agenda. You can see if you really pay attention to people when you're talking with them, sometimes they have hidden agendas. The Bodhisattva is giving up hidden agenda. There is no hidden agenda. There's constant, accurate responsiveness without that scheming of some kind of dream that goes on in our heads when we have our hidden agendas. What am I going to get out of this? How can I manipulate this situation? And you don't tell the person. It's just going on inside. It's painful. So it's a source, this Mahakaruna, of great genuineness in the person. They become genuine and don't have the hidden agenda. What they say and what they're doing, what they're presenting is who and what they are. He says, in the case of great compassion, there is no attempt to avoid anything because everything is clear. Everything is completely seen through. Just right here. And then the second quality is luminosity, which he defines as brilliance or brightness. The term is urselwa. Wa is a nominative, makes it into a noun. Ursel is an adjective. It means luminous. Means light. Sel means glowing. So it's glowing light. It's luminous. Urselwa is brilliance or brightness. This is a term that carries all the way into the Vajrayana, because what it refers to, he says, at heart is an eternal rejoicing, joyful, delightful situation. That's what Urselwa is, that one could experience this right now. He says, although there might be occasional attacks of neurosis, where you get lost in thought again, paranoid thoughts, as a practitioner of great compassion, you do not give in to them. And beyond that, Ursel becomes this quality of the beauty, the glowing quality of this world. It's communicated in art by the glowing quality of your art. But it's here in the world all the time. The next one is skillfulness. Tapla, kepa. Kepa means skilled, and tapla is the means, the way in which you interact with the world. And he says, because you have no fear of yourself, no sense of poverty, no hidden agenda. So you have no fear of yourself or other, or of the situation. Then you're completely in touch with what is happening. You're just right here. You're not lost in some hidden agenda. When we each have experienced hidden agendas in our heads, we're not here really. We're talking to somebody, but we're really thinking, what am I going to get out of this situation? Or how do I protect myself in this situation? Or where is this situation going? And you're not 100% present. But when you have tapla kepa, that means that you are just right here. Then you can be completely responsive. Accurately so. The third one is peace, or this is the fourth one. Shiva. Shiva, again, was a nominative. She means peaceful. And we're absent all of those scheming, paranoid, poverty-stricken concerns. It is a quality of vast space. You don't give in to the occasional upheavals. I've never given in, he says. This is all the quality of the Bodhisattva. We are just beginning to enter this path, but we can understand the logic of it. The logic of coming present, of giving up the machinations of thought. Finally, there's this section, joining depth and benevolence. He talks about you can't be harsh about your own ego, because that's ego again. You could say, my ego is terrible, I'm going to get rid of it, I'm going to kill it, I'm going to squash it. Who's saying that? Ego. So egolessness can only happen if you have a sympathetic, compassionate attitude to your own ego. Only then does it dissolve. And he says that profundity, this is shunyata, no I or other, and vastness, which is compassion, they work together into the destruction of this mythic ego. This is really important, that the understanding of emptiness, no I nor other, and compassion, which is a feeling of openness, open-heartedness, participation, the pleasure of being of help. These two go together hand in glove. They work with each other. So the Bodhisattva vow, which says, in effect, I don't believe in myself and I don't believe in others. Nevertheless, I would like to save all sentient beings before I attain my own enlightenment. Because there's really nothing else to do. When you begin to give up the machinations, these interior monologues of I, there's really nothing left to do but to be interactive with others. And as you begin, each one of us begins, however faintly, it comes in little bits and pieces, to appreciate the kindness that we can have towards ourselves. Then it becomes very natural to wish to extend it out to others. There's great quality of pleasure and love. He says, he's talking about the traditions of vastness, compassion, and profundity, egolessness, shunyata, coming together. Because of the warmth of vastness, compassion, you don't have to defend yourself anymore. And you realize that there is no defender. So a big dissolve happens. That seems to be the basic idea of compassion. So compassion is not just being loving and emotionally kind. It is actually compassion that cuts through any kind of belief. Aggression dissolves, an opening up process is taking place. Finally, I'll just read this line. When you do not have to maintain anything at all, because everything is okay, there is no confusion. See, confusion is just another story that we tell ourselves. That is the epitome of twofold egolessness. There is both the profundity of the twofold egolessness and the vastness of compassionate bodhisattva activity. And when we take the bodhisattva vow, we are committing ourselves to this path of egolessness and compassion. That is what the Mahayana is at its core. Those are two sides of the same coin, the Mahayana. Fundamental shunyata, egolessness, this world as a constant fluidity and constant changing, and the beauty in the heart that can come in that world when we give up this constant preoccupation with I and other. But it takes a lot. It takes practice, it takes study, it takes commitment, and ultimately conviction. And ultimately you have to give up all of that. So we could have a discussion Meg,
The statement, how is, I think Dan said this, how is doubt is transformed into compassion. And I saw that in the book too. And I wondered, first of all, what is that doubt? Is it self-doubt? I'm not exactly sure what that doubt is. And then how is that transformed into compassion? It's not really clear to me.
well, perhaps I put it out to you that all doubt is fundamentally self-doubt. It's a questioning of the validity of something relative to me. Now, that doesn't mean if somebody says the sky is purple or the sky is black or something, and you look up and it's blue, and you say, you could say, I doubt the truth of what you're saying. But he's talking about something much more fundamental. And really, he's talking about the doubt that comes from, it's the fundamental doubt of, am I okay? And I want to be okay. And I'm not okay. That kind of doubt. And when one begins to give that up and replace that with a feeling of warmth towards oneself and warmth towards others, that's the Mahayana path. And it comes very naturally and easily. In fact, when one begins to give up the activity of doubting, see, doubting is all about wishing that you could find something else to replace what you feel is not good enough. And when one begins to give that up, then you begin to appreciate what's here. And so that appreciation is really another word for compassion. Does that make sense or not?
I mean, it does. I wonder if that compassion is also, the way that I was reading it is it's compassion for other people that are sharing the same doubt.
Absolutely. You could definitely be that. Yes. That would be a marvelous compassion. Yeah. That's extremely kind compassion.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. It's very. See, we're all exploring this, trying to find our way into this heart and this compassion, just like what Meg just did. We're all sort of exploring our way into a very different world. It's not the world of I and other, which we've grown up with. It's the world of emptiness that's being described, which is terribly profound and different. And it's full of compassion, which we can appreciate in glimpses, but my gosh, what they're talking about here, Maha compassion, great compassion, with all of those characteristics.
Meg, that was my reading on it too. It's like when you walk around and when I'm walking around in doubt and self-doubt, really, it's like, what am I doing? I'm not doing anything right. I'm messing everything up, or just had a difficult interaction with my daughter or whoever. I think to myself, yeah, everyone's walking around with this suffering. And it's kind of like that. I think it's attributed to Mother Teresa, but always be kind to others because you never know what burden they're carrying.
Huh.
Everyone's carrying the same burden. And also the joy into wisdom. That's a little harder to see, I think. But I think working the joy into wisdom is the wisdom of seeing the truth, which is that no real joy comes from anything out there. That the joy has to, the wisdom is the joy has to come from within. So when you have the joy that you're excited about going on this Bodhisattva path because you're going to become a great Bodhisattva, and you start thinking, yeah, if I'm counting on that kind of feedback coming from the outside, that's not going to give me any real permanent joy.
Thank you.
I got a comment on this no goal orientation. I was talking about this with a friend this weekend about Milarepa. He famously said, "I'm going to attain enlightenment in one lifetime." And I don't know what that speaks to. It's so complex. Is it like the hopelessness that if you get a good teacher, you're going to attain enlightenment in one time? Or it also speaks to like what a bumpy journey that is. I don't know. It's a complex thing.
Maybe it spoke to the fact that he wasn't enlightened yet.
Yeah.
That's what allowed him to say that. And he said that, I'm going to achieve enlightenment. He hadn't gotten it yet. So maybe he hadn't discovered goallessness yet.
Yeah.
Yet.
Yeah, that's it. I don't know if you ever saw, there's a meme of Batman and Robin. And Robin says in the meme, it's like a little comic strip. It's like, "Hey, Batman, I've attained enlightenment." And Batman slaps him and says, "There is no I, keep meditating."
That's good.
And I'll just repeat, there are so many stories about Milarepa, and the one about his chief disciple, Gampopa, asking, and we do the 4 dharmas of Gampopa every morning, asking him what is the secret to his spiritual attainment. And he turns his back to Gampopa, raises up his robes, and shows him his ass, which is covered with calluses from sitting. It's
I got a picture of that in a comic book. Some artist did like the life story of Milarepa, and they have that rendition in there.
Oh, did they? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I've seen a comic. It was a big comic. It was,
Yep.
yeah, sort of a graphic novel kind of thing of the life of Milarepa. I think it had something to do with Dzongzar Kensei. Anyhow. Anybody?
You also have to remember, Fred, that Milarepa was a mass murderer. Yeah. And yeah. So
Yeah. Very complex.
you may
dude.
have set the bar a little lower than you are.
All right.
Yeah, but then that brings up like, I don't know if it's like hopelessness. It's like, hey, if he could do it, he did everything wrong. It's like, it's just like, wow.
Sure.
What does that say?
Says you can do it. There was one of the disciples of the Buddha, his name means garland of fingers, because he murdered people, and when he killed them, he would cut their fingers off and made them into a thing that he wore around his neck. I can't remember what the Sanskrit name is, or whatever it was, Hindi.
Angulimala.
Thank you.
Angulimala.
Angulimala. Very good. That's his name, Angulimala. Right. And he got enlightened.
You can start anywhere.
You can. So if these guys can do it, we can.
Every saint has a past, every sinner a future.
Anybody else?
Was it,
Somebody's saying something? No?
yeah,
Oh, there he goes, Judith.
yeah. Dwelling on any experience could be regarded as the activity of aggression from the Buddhist perspective. That's because you're analyzing and dwelling upon what has happened or what might happen instead of being present. Is that correct?
I think it has to do with trying to get something out of it. You know, and that's an aggressive attitude. That's what my take. What does anybody else have? Yes, Ed.
Yeah, I would say dwelling is the key there. Just when it's probably the flip side of what you were saying. Holding, keeping, personalizing any experience to the point where it becomes an object to grasp.
Grasping, yeah.
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 Grasping in order to assuage one's feeling of poverty, to further one's goal orientation,
Yeah.
which makes you so unhappy.
Yeah, and then the dwelling is just pulling you back into thought machinations and out of the present. So yeah, just
So it takes you out of the present.
I think so. That's what it means to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is fundamentally required is that we begin to realize that this is real and that all those thoughts are not,
Yeah.
that they're myth, fiction, worse. Rinpoche once bellowed at me, lies.
Yeah. But it's just manufactured garbage. Thoughts. I mean, other than steering your car or, you know, cooking dinner.
Danielle.
I was gonna say I'm glad that you mentioned that, Judith, because I was like way back in the 90s for a long time today, and like I was just wanting to be in the 90s, but then I was like I don't want to be in the 90s, so I really had to make myself come back, and I think that's what kind of dwelling on other things, that was something that happened to me today, and I'm like, stop dwelling there, but it was entertaining and stuff. And is that what you were talking about, kind of like dwelling on that stuff? I don't know, I was missing the 90s.
Dwelling on any experience
Yeah,
could be regarded as the activity of aggression.
I like how you put aggression.
But interpreting, also that what did they mean by that? What is he really up to? How can I change what's going on? How can I manipulate this if I can interpret it correctly? All that baloney. It's just,
Like past discussions, past conversations, it's like over now, just let it go, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's very freeing. It lightens you up to just leave it off and say, who knows?
It's aggression, and it's like taking you away from now, like you said. So I'm glad you brought that up. Sorry. Thanks.
Oh, well, thanks.
It also sounds like that's where the doubt creeps in too. Like, hey, it used to be like this. And then is this a fiction? It's like,
What am I looking at?
Yeah.
Better to just be done with it. Be done with it. You don't have to do that. It feels good when you can do that.
Philip, you look like you have something. No? Okay. Randy?
I was thinking that, speaking of Bill Wilson, one of the things that I always heard said was that we were all not seeking, but we're looking for progress, not perfection. And so we're progressing along the path, and we're never going to get it done right. I don't think we'll ever get enlightenment. But anyway, it's just progress, not perfection. It was one of the what did he call those things?
Slogan.
Slogans. Thank you, Dan. Yes.
It's interesting how Bill Wilson is such a presence in our Sangha.
I went all throughout Buddhism to me.
Yeah, all of Buddhism, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I heard a number of years ago that's relevant here, I heard it in a meeting, was let go or be dragged. Let go or be dragged.
Do you think we could assume that Bill Wilson was really a great Bodhisattva?
I think if Bill was alive today, this is just an opinion, but I have no doubt he'd be on the cushion. No doubt whatsoever.
Who at the risk of being who is Bill Wilson? Is he the 12-step guy?
Yeah,
He's a co-founder of alcohol.
co-founder of AA.
Oh, thank you.
But the book is attributed to Anonymous.
Mm.
Well, friends, anybody have anything else? Because we're getting close to 7. We should end. Looking. If not, I'll put the chance up.
Okay, I have one quick thing.
Please, Christy.
So, I mean, I just think about how much of my life I've spent in thought. I mean, is thought good for anything? I guess is something that keeps occurring to me. What do you think? Maybe if it's
Driving your
for,
car.
maybe if it's for like other people, if it's,
Let me put it to you this way. When you come present, it never happened. All those thoughts only are remembered in thought. But when you come completely present, never happened. Because this is the real world.
yes.
So let's dedicate the merit, like good bodhisattvas that we are. And let's see, is it Sarah? Are you going to be leading the chant?
I can, unless Meg wants to.
Oh, Meg, that's right, Meg. I'm sorry, Meg.
No, you said there was something different you were doing, so I'll let Sarah do it.
We already did it. So you're
Okay.
up. Huh?
Okay, I'll do it.
Too bad. Okay, I'm going to mute all and then unmute yourself, Meg. I'll just mute all here so everybody, we don't have cacophony.